Hey guys, so now we are in the second episode of the Khosrau series by Extra History. This one is called The Prince of Persia, so let's find out more about this man, shall we?
Following his father's death, Kavad had staved off disaster time and again for the empire. But yearly peace tributes to the Hephthalites had left the Iranian treasury bare. Nothing was left to help the farmers who fed the empire. Without help, Kavad's people would soon starve. In desperation, he turned to his neighbors, the Eastern Roman Empire.
Heck yeah, Rome is here. When isn't Rome not here? I always love it because it's like, sometimes I miss certain periods of history we cover on this channel. Like, sometimes I do miss the Napoleon series by Epic History that we covered mainly last year. Last year, 2024, a lot of Napoleon content on this channel. But, I feel like we kind of bled that era dry. There's no more videos to really watch. So and once in a while I'll be like, I'll miss it, but it's a period we've covered enough of. And yeah, some topics I do miss because, we're done with them, with whatever series or videos regarding them, and, there's not much else to cover, but I never miss Rome because I've said before, Rome never goes away. Rome is like in every other series, even when it's not supposed to be centered around them, Rome gets like mentioned or like referenced, or it's like they're in the background. So I'm like, dang, Rome was literally just everywhere, huh? It still is. Probably maybe the most important entity in history at this point, because Rome is just always there at one point or another. Might be the most important or influential thing ever in human history. That's why I never miss Rome, because Rome's always here, guys, It always appears in these videos, so, like, yeah. I don't mean that in a bad way. I love Rome, by the way. It's just, like, I've noticed that. Haven't you guys noticed that? It's always everywhere. Like, Rome just lives on. It lives on in the hearts of all of us history content creators and reactors and history buffs. Just Rome will always be there.
Despite countless generations of conflict between Rome and Iran, the two empires had been at peace for nearly a century. Nomadic tribes across the Caucasus Mountains to the north had forced them to agree on terms of mutual defense. Iran would guard the pass through the mountains, called the Caucasian Gates, so long as Rome sent money to help pay the soldiers. But the Romans had gotten kinda distracted. They were all like, we're kinda dealing with these other wars in the north right now, and also in the west, and wait, ah, crap, the Ostrogoths just took Rome. Like, actual Rome. Oh, jeez. Can you guys handle the northern tribes thing while we... Hey, you guys give that back, I'm not kidding!
Stablecoins are the new hotness. They're all...
Rome had stopped paying for the northern defense. And since Iran had their own problems at the time, multiple wars with the Hephthalites and their king dying, followed by a decade of political turmoil, they weren't exactly in a position to press the issue. But now that Kavad had finally pulled his empire back together, now it was time to press. Kavad reached out to the Roman Emperor Anastasius and insisted that Rome pay its share. That would take some of the strain off of Iran's treasury, so Kavad could subsidize his farmers and avoid a famine. But Anastasius replied, saying, well, we never technically signed an agreement or anything, so we're not going to pay you back. But hey, we can give you a loan. To which Kavad responded, I'll loan my fist to your face, and went to war. Now, waging war...
That's hilarious. So yeah, the Sasanian Empire, one of Rome's great enemies, I believe it succeeded the Parthians before them. So it's interesting because, as much as we've covered them, it's always been Rome and the Sasanians or the Parthians before them, around that region of Iran, always at war, always beefing, always having a constant enemy. It was interesting to learn right now about their little agreement. I want to use the term alliance, but yeah, they were mutually trying to like benefit each other, obviously, with all the outside groups trying to break into their empires and taking it. it was interesting to learn that the Sasanians had a force that was sort of protection, and that the Romans were supposed to basically cough up money to keep that defense going. Like, it's this weird partnership. And that was interesting to learn in almost a century of peace. That's just interesting for a brief moment there. You know, obviously there have been ceasefires with Rome and its enemies, but it's interesting to learn that there was some mutual, you know, like, alliance, I guess is the word I'm trying to use there, though. Not in, like, an official capacity, as Anastasia said, well, we never signed anything. What a jerk. You know, well, technically, we never signed, so I don't owe you crap, you know? Even though that does help Rome in a way, that little arrangement there was supposed to benefit Rome at the same time. And yeah, I think it's interesting watching the Byzantine era of Rome, because, you know, we often cover the early Rome, mainly its rise and its expansion. And then, like, the Byzantine era is just, outside of, like, Justinian, really just a slow decline, as they're basically surrounded by enemies on all fronts, west and east, and it's just the Romans struggling to continue existing as they shrink slower and, like, slower, they get smaller and smaller, constantly fighting enemies on every end, new groups emerging. I don't know, I really like the Byzantine era of Rome, because it really is just, like, Rome at its most underdog. You know, they're the underdogs in the world, though, you know, still formidable, but they're still on a decline. So that's why I always kind of like the Byzantine era of Rome. Like, I think I definitely have a greater appreciation now towards it, than I do than any other era of Rome. And yeah.
Is generally not a good idea for empires on the brink of ruin, but Kavad really needed this one. Raiding food and supplies from the border cities of the Roman Empire solved his immediate problem of feeding his own empire, and it also solved his long-term problem of getting the Hephthalites off his back. As Iran's eastern neighbors, the Hephthalites very much enjoyed watching Iran go to war with the West. They liked it so much that they sent their own soldiers to join in the looting, which was actually pretty handy because the Hephthalites had wiped out the core of Iran's army 10 years ago. This war lasted only a few years, but it ended with Rome finally agreeing to pay tribute to Iran. Kavad had adopted the superior swords and bows of his Hephthalite allies, and built his broken army back into a power to be feared. But he had done so at the cost of reigniting Iran's age-old rivalry with Rome. The Romans now openly broke their prior treaty obligations. Both empires had previously agreed to stop building military fortifications on their shared border, as a gesture of good faith. But as soon as Kavad got distracted by Turkic tribes invading through the Caucasian gates, Anastasius bought every building in a small village called Dara and rapidly built it into a shoddy little fort. When Kavad turned back around and saw a fort where there had definitely not been a fort before, he asked, "Hey, did you put that fort there?" And Anastasius answered, That? No, that's always been there. Here, take some gold, go fight your Turks or whatever." Kavad did have his hands full with the whole Turk situation, and then beating up his former Hephthalite allies, so it took him a while to get back to this Rome issue. By the time he finally did, things had changed.
Yeah, I like Emperor Anastasia. Comes across as a complete troll, right? Yeah. I find that funny. Overall, I really do like when we watch videos, because, you know, the thing is, it's like, I notice, like, obviously, depending on what video we're watching and whose perspective we're following, you know, like, for instance, like, when we're watching, like a series about Alexander, he's essentially, like, for example, from Kings and Generals, it's like, the perspective is on Alexander, he's the quote-unquote main character, and, you know, as we watch these videos, I always kind of gravitate towards a character. It's like, oh, he's the main character of this series. Obviously, Khosrau is the main character of this series, but then as we're following this series, and the main character, the center of attention, the perspective, the enemy comes across as this almost like different, an obstacle, an antagonist, this obstacle that's just there to basically be this almost inhuman force that the protagonist needs to overcome. And obviously when we follow so many Rome-centered videos, like Rome is, the bastion, the main character, if you would, and then all its enemies are these outside foreign, like monsters out to destroy. I think Dovahati best parodies that perspective. Like Rome is literally the main character and all the enemies are depicted as ungodly eldritch monsters. But I like it because as we switch through different series and perspective, like here in this series, we're following an enemy of Rome, Khosrau, the Sasanians, and then you just see like how like normal, how much issues they have, and you remember, yeah, they're human too, like at the end, all these empires, all these groups of people, it's just all people at the end. They have their ups, their downs, just like Rome, their own internal struggles, and they all struggle to continue to exist from other people. It's like, I don't know, I think overall it really humanizes everyone, and it gives a more human perspective of just everything, which I really like. I think like the Richard the Lion, the Third Crusade series by Extra History is also another great example. Because, I didn't know much about Saladin. Obviously, I heard about him as his rivalry with Richard, and I kind of always envisioned Saladin as some kind of like genius war leader, this like almost high stature figure. And then when we watch the series, he's just a guy, and he struggles a lot, and he has his ups and his downs, and it's just like, you tend to forget with all these great empires and people in history that they're just people at the end, with their own flaws and good traits, and there's struggle, and there's turmoil, and there's obstacles to overcome, they have personalities, obviously, it's just, they're all people. And I think I kind of like watching so many different perspectives, because you just remember, yeah, at the end, even all these great figures in history, all these great empires are just run by people like us, and I don't know, it's just more humanizing to see. Like, it's not so much, kind of like in America, sometimes we idolize the founding fathers, and obviously they were great men, intelligent men who accomplished a lot, but then you learn about their petty squabbles, their political rivalries, and you just remember they're guys like anyone else, and they're not, obviously because of what they accomplished, we kind of have like a legendary I'm not saying the word right, mythologized, that's not the way it's supposed to be said, but you know what I mean, viewpoint of them. But then, like, when you break it down, like I said, they're just normal people, like anyone else. So, I don't know, this has just been me rambling, but overall, I do like watching this series and seeing so many different ways. It's just, at the end, after watching so many series on this channel, definitely has humanized me towards history and the people in it.
Anastasius had died without declaring an heir. An upstart pig farmer named Justin had stepped into his place, although all reports indicated that his nephew Justinian was the real brains behind the throne. Still, it was a stark reminder to the aging Kavad that it was never too soon to choose an heir. The most obvious candidate was his eldest son, Kawus, who not only had seniority, but currently served as a governor of a northern province. But Kawus was a fervent Mazdakite, and Kavad had spent years now trying to distance himself from that whole mess. His second son had lost an eye, which technically disqualified him under Iranian rules of succession.
Wow.
And then there was Khosrau, his...
Yeah, that's interesting. When we were covering the Fourth Crusade series by Kings and Generals, there was a lot of blinding in that series. Like, whenever a king or someone would take power, they usually would blind the former king or emperor or like anyone who could potentially be a rival. They wouldn't kill them, they would blind them. And some people were telling me, oh yeah, they did that because technically once you were blinded, you were disqualified from ruling or like ruling effectively. And I do know several points in history where people just did that. They didn't kill their political opponents, they blinded them. And that would, I guess, be a way of showing they can't rule. And so I think it's interesting. I just remember that right now as I see, well, he only has one eye. He's technically been blinded, even if it's one eye. So, that disqualifies him. So I think that's just got reminded of that. And that was really interesting.
Third son, his favorite. The one who had already made allies at court by denouncing the Mazdakites. Not a hard choice, actually. But the Mazdakites remained a problem. Even without Kavad's support, their goals of a classless society and equal distribution of wealth continued to win converts across the empire.
Communism? No, I'm joking.
They were still vastly outnumbered by followers of traditional Zoroastrianism, though, and a backlash eventually swelled against the Mazdakites and their radical ideas. Priests pushed to enforce official doctrine all across the empire, even in the border territories, which Iran had traditionally allowed to do their own thing. For many of those territories, doing their own thing meant being Christian, so having Zoroastrian doctrine suddenly enforced on them did not go over very well. It all came to a head in 524 CE when one Iranian territory with a Christian king decided to defect to Rome. Kavad reached out to Justin to see if they could resolve this peacefully. Justin, buddy, hey, just a thought, maybe stop accepting our runaway territories into your empire and let's just be friends, okay? And hey, as a gesture of good faith to seal this friendship, I'll let you adopt Khosrau as your son. The adoption offer was mostly a formality. Khosrau was a grown man. He wasn't exactly going to move to Constantinople and start calling Justin dad. But the gesture could bring the two empires together, and Roman support could help Khosrau claim the throne when Kavad died. In fact, the Iranians had done exactly this same thing for Rome in the 4th century, when a previous Shah had adopted the emperor's son to secure his succession. Kavad felt that it was high time Rome returned that favor. Justin loved this idea. His advisors did not love it as much. They worried that this symbolic gesture might be the first step of a sneaky campaign to place Khosrau on the throne of the Roman Empire. They suggested maybe tone it down a little. So ambassadors from both sides met on the border, with Khosrau himself waiting in the wings. The Romans said, "Great news, our emperor will adopt you, but not as a Roman and an equal son. No, he's already got one of those. But he will adopt you as a barbarian." To which Khosrau responded, "He can adopt my fist to his face," and went to war. The war started out great for Iran. Kicking the Romans up and down the frontier felt just like old times. By now, though, Justin had died and left the empire in the hands of his ambitious nephew, who began an aggressive push to fortify more places along the border. The newly reinforced city of Dara, which Kavad always knew would be trouble, handed Iran their first major loss. In the peace negotiations that followed, Kavad insisted that the Romans pull down their fortifications at Dara and start paying their fair share to defend the Caucasian gates. He did not live to hear Justinian's response. Kavad passed away in 531 CE, leaving a will that declared Khosrau should inherit his throne. The nobles quickly voted to confirm his choice, and at last, it was Khosrau's time to shine.
Yeah, we finally have arrived at Khosrau. It was cool to see Kavad, though. Like, Kavad's definitely an underrated guy, and was pretty effective in his ruling, so I think it was cool to start with him, and yeah, I think it's a good setup for Khosrau now. So, yeah, overall, GG Kavad, very interesting, underrated figure. I really like the guy.
But all the problems from his father's reign hit Khosrau at once. A new wave of invaders poured through the Caucasian gates, and the Iranian army was still tied up in the war with Rome. Khosrau called on his brother Kawus, who still governed a province up north, to repel the invaders. Kawus took care of the problem quickly, but then claimed that his victory proved that maybe he should be Shah instead of Khosrau. And since Kawus was a Mazdakite, Mazdak and his followers immediately joined his cause. Khosrau needed his army back, which meant he needed to make peace with Justinian and recall the army from the borders of Rome. He invited Justinian's envoys into his court, but the envoys replied that they would not negotiate anything. Justinian had caught wind of Cauus's rebellion and hoped to sow as much chaos into Iran as he could, so he refused to recognize Khosrau as the new Shah. Cauus came to Ctesiphon to press his claim to the throne, and Khosrau watched his allies begin slipping away. Most nobles refused to recognize his brother, but a few quietly began to switch sides. The Mazdakites had given Cauus a strong base of support, and Khosrau decided that he needed to take that support away. He invited Mazdak and his people to come to his palace without Cauus, promising to hear their demands. The invitation was a trap. As the Mazdakites entered his courtyard, Khosrau had them cut down. One story, which is probably just a story, but it goes to show how ruthless Khosrau was perceived to be, says that he planted their corpses upside down in his garden, and invited Mazdak to gaze upon these unique and beautiful trees. Then he had Mazdak hanged from the gallows. Now that Cauus no longer had his most powerful ally, he was...
Holy crap. Alright, ruthlessness. Overall, love Justinian. Freaking playing the game of politics and just trying to really weaken his foe. Love seeing Rome do that. But yeah, Khosrau, man, like I like the subtlety was God. He was like, I'm just gonna kill them. Like Kavad was really trying to deal with them like in some like non like aggressive way, and he was like, Khosrau was just like, you know what? I'm just gonna murder them. Like, you know, ruthless but effective. Like at this point it's like I gotta do what I gotta do. You know, that's kind of the thing about ruling, is that I've heard like being a nice person isn't, I mean granted this is a long time ago and like human standards and like things are different. I don't believe in completely judging people from the past, you know, at least from history, by our modern standards, because obviously it was a long time ago and like things were different in the world, you know, especially in different parts of the world, obviously. That's why I don't really fully judge anyone completely by our modern standards. But obviously what he did was super aggressive. But like what I was getting at is, you know, you don't have to be a nice person to be a good king or an emperor. You know, it's not a qualification, being nice. And I think at times in history that is true. I mean, not to say there haven't ever been nice people, but there have been nice people who were inept at ruling. I know, we've covered a few on this channel, so I don't know. I think it's interesting, and I think more being efficient, you know, is probably the more higher goal. So yeah, overall, that was just a thought I had.
Was easy prey. Khosrau captured him and dragged him in front of the priests. He offered to set Cauus free if he begged forgiveness in front of all the holy men at court. Cauus replied that he preferred death to humiliation, and Khosrau obliged. Then he hunted down every one of Cauus's sons and executed them before they could even think of avenging their father or stealing the throne. It was at this point that Khosrau returned his attention to Justinian's envoys and informed them that he was now, without question, the Shah of Iran. Would they like to make...
Yeah, there have been times in history where, like, you know, a king or emperor, we've seen plenty of times, have multiple sons, and when one son finally succeeds, he usually ends up killing all his brothers. You know, just to solidify their claim. And yeah, it's just ruthless, man. But sometimes you have to. Like, sometimes you can't even trust your own family. And I think that's like the sad life. I often said in the past, you know, I could never, or even want to be like a ruler or a king in more ancient times in history, because it's just like, you have enemies everywhere. And even among your own family, like, some people will gladly turn on you and like, you know, like, I imagine that's that has to be, at least for me, I feel like a paranoia-inducing life, you know? It's like, who do you trust when you're the top dog, you know? Very few, very little. So yeah, it does seem like yeah, I guess the title or the glamour of king or emperor sounds nice, but after watching so many of these videos, it just seems like a life that, while more privileged than a peasant, mind you, but also, like, in its own way, kind of sucks because you could have enemies everywhere and people ready to turn on you, and then outside, not only outside enemies, but even within your own court, so I don't know. Yes, I would go full on paranoid. I'd be like, everyone's my foe. You know? Like the Mad King for Game of Thrones. Burn them all! You know? Alright, let's get back
Make
to
peace
this.
with him now. Justinian decided that, yes, he very much would. He handed over 11,000 pounds of gold to pay for the defense of the Caucasian Gates and withdrew his military base from Dara. But Khosrau would not forget or forgive this Roman emperor for failing to support his succession.
Yeah, Justinian really did try to kick him when he was down. So, yeah, it'll be cool to see more about what Khosrau does and his chess game literally with Rome, and if that's gonna play even further, because I do know him as a very strong opponent of the Romans. So yeah, another very solid video. I think I'll end it here, and tomorrow we'll continue. Bye everyone.